I'm glad to introduce the speaker of today, Professor Alfons Puigarnau. I have to say it's not the first time he's talking in India. He was precisely in Somaiya and in Delhi University in 2019. This time also could have been in India, but because of the circumstances, it has to be online. In fact, he will be talking, he's talking directly from Florence in Italy, where he's doing some research for a couple of months. So Professor Puigarnau is a professor of philosophy at the School of Architecture in the International University of Catalonia. This is a private university also, like Somaiya Vidyavihar, in the city of Barcelona. This university started in 1997, and Professor Puigarnau has been teaching since 2001, so practically the entire history of this university is part of his life. He studied art history at the University of Barcelona and got his PhD from another university in the same city called Pompeu Fabra. His research was on the Western traditions of theology of light in late antiquity and medieval cultures. And that is why this research led him to the relationship between art and the different Neoplatonic systems of thought. He has several publications and is also a member of the International Society of Neoplatonic Studies. As you know, Neoplatonism started with Plotinus in the 3rd century of this era and is, towards the end of that period known as the ancient or Greco-Roman philosophy. In today's talk, this series of talks, 3 talks starting today and following next Monday and the following Monday at the same time, there will be this relationship between Neoplatonism and Western art. Today there will be an introduction. The topic will be from myth to logos. And in the following Mondays, there will be the topics on theology and the visual arts and art, thought, and experience. So Professor Puigarnau will give his presentation, his lecture, divided, so it's 1 hour and a half, divided in 3 blocks, no, of 20-25 minutes each, in order that at the end of each block, there is a possibility of questions and answers, clarification of doubts, etc. So, well, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Alfons Puigarnau for his presence today here, for being available, for being with so much generosity during these 3 Mondays, consecutive Mondays, in which we are ready to learn from his knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mariano, for your words. I hope that the technological systems can work properly. We have tested it on the last Saturday altogether. And yes, it's always a pleasure to be with you from we say the old continent, Europe, to the great and young, but also old subcontinent of India, where, as Dr. Mariano said, I have intervened in 2019 with great pleasure. By then, Somaiya was not already a private university, and it is my first point to say that I'm very happy that you have turned into this great new, in some way, institution. I have to thank Dr. Supriya Ray, director of the Institute of Dharma Studies of the Somaiya Bharatiya Sanskriti Peetham, as well as to the principal of Somaiya Bharatiya Sanskriti Peetham, Mrs. Prachi Patak. It's it's a real privation not to be with you all together physically. I know this because when I was with you there, in some way, I was very impressed by your spiritual energy and by your humanly company. We enjoy very much, and it was an unforgettable meeting of all together. I hope you, everybody, feel well after or during this difficult pandemic for everybody. And it is a privilege to be telematically today with all of you. The first time I talked in your institution, I wanted to do a comparison between our Western Neoplatonic tradition that was founded by the Greek non-Christian philosopher and theologian Plotinus with your, I would say, with respect, kind of Indian Aquinas, Shankara. Indian Aquinas, which I said this with respect and with pride, because Aquinas has been for us, for the Western tradition, one of the founders of this new kind of conciliation between faith and reason, which, as we know, it is not needed in the Indian philosophical and religious system. But for us to say that Shankara is the kind of Indian Aquinas is so beautiful, and it is so important for us. That's why in this very first session, with your help, I publicly had the, so to speak, the courage of making a bit of proposal of comparative philosophy in that very time, invited very personally by Professor Mariano Iturbe. This is the second time. This is the second time. Maybe in this second time, I feel nearer you. I feel more secure. But as always, I have to talk from my respect and from a mentality which is not in terms of what is the better or what is the worse in terms of ideas and categories of thought, but in terms of what we can learn one from each other. In these first 20 minutes, it is something quite difficult but quite striking and quite challenging to say what is the sense of this seminar. What is the original idea that brought us to say, well, why don't we think all together in a louder voice in order to share important problems of our corresponding traditions. And then with the valuable collaboration of Professor Iturbe, he said, well, can we explain, can we bridge our two traditions, Western and Eastern, or if you like, because it is the case, no, Christian and Hindu traditions, so that we can understand mutually better. And this, in fact, this bipolarity between, or apparent bipolarity between logos and mythos is how you can see the screen now. Do you see the screen properly?
Yes, sir, we can see.
Thank you. It seems to be something a bit abrupt, no? Say, kind of to feel obliged to say whether mythos or logos, and this kind of obligation to say where we are now, what are our sources of thought, of sensitivity, so that it seems that in Western traditions, we have had to move from mythos to logos, these two Greek terms. Which I'm sure that the Indian tradition has no need to do. And we have to see, with your help, to what extent this difference between Indian and European intellectual traditions or history of cultures are in some ways so different and so complementary. I have always been very scared to speak of these things, addressing myself to people who are experts in Sanskrit. I mean, for me, it is a big challenge. Last time when I spoke in public, we discovered that my pronunciation of Sanskrit is perfect, almost perfect. This is something that I didn't know about that, but whenever I pronounced some of your beautiful words, at the end of the last conference, someone told me, where did you learn your good Sanskrit? No, where I never had the chance to study Sanskrit. No? But being this an Indo-European tradition, being the fact that we in some way have common linguistical roots, we can say that we are linguistical brothers, even though. But I am very aware of the importance, and this is a big topic, of sound and communication in Indian culture, as far as it is so important in Western culture, image. And this is something that it's very relevant for now to say that Western culture is going to be ultimately dominated, but the ocular. Our culture is going to be dominated by how are things from the perspective of the human eye. Whereas, and thanks to Sanskrit language, Hinduism, of course, Hinduism has a visual culture, doubtless. But to what extent Hinduism is a more, let's say, musical a more ritual in the linguistical sense, a more liturgical culture, that even it is Western culture. In this beautiful book by Annette Wilke and Oliver Moebius, that surely you have to know about this, I'm sure, entitled Sound of Communication and Aesthetic Cultural History of Sanskrit Hinduism, we read that anyone speaking about communication, at least in today's Western culture area, will not necessarily think of sound as an independent medium of expression and communication. And anyone studying texts is interested in the content and hardly aware that texts also always have a material quality, their sound, and can be perceived in a sensory and emotional way. I'm thinking of Sanskrit, your traditions, and the importance of this sound aesthetic culture in your religious and philosophical systems. In Hinduistic India, things are different from Western traditions. Since earliest times, sound in Hinduistic India has enjoyed great cultural importance. Reading out a religious text in Sanskrit means reciting it in a musically pleasing way and with the utmost care regarding correct pronunciation. In turn, simply listening to the sound of a religious text, it is already held to be auspicious and purifying. The same predominance of sound is seen in metaphysics, where sound becomes a means of interpreting and understanding the world. These sophisticated cosmologies of the Tantra are also based on the letters of the alphabet, and mysterious sound codes serve as models for explaining the creation of the world and language. Of course, if I am wrong with this, please interrupt me immediately. That's why it is fundamental in our approach in these, from mythos to logos, the concept here, participation and emancipation, with which we reformulate the ancient European dichotomy between mythos and logos. And we give it a new frame. We talk about participation and emancipation. In contrast to the Occidental history of rationalization, Hinduistic India did not see any necessity to have mythos devalorized by logos. Despite familiarity with formalistic logic at an early stage of history, the emergence in India of profound philosophies, spectacular findings in linguistics and mathematics, and a highly developed literary culture, etc. Because it seems at the first glance that only with logos we can attain all of these discoveries, but it is not in India. India also has a long history of rationalization, but obviously the cultural expressions differ from the Occidental history of rationalization as outlined by Max Weber. It is not only a different intellectual history, but equally a different history of the senses, and I underlined before, the ocular centrism to the ear centrism, the senses, a different history of ritual expressions, of course, of social practices, and a different history of interiority and worldviews. That's why it is, I have seen things in this way that we cannot avoid as an introductory concept for this seminar of 3 sessions. I cannot avoid to talk about philosophy comparison. I mean, we have to compare, because in this introduction, if we don't compare, we cannot understand mutually our cultural frameworks. Let's put, maybe to finish with this first kind of pill, let me put you an example which is quite interesting of what I want to mean with all these. In the year 1030, which is the 11th century of the modern era, some Muslim astronomer called Al-Biruni traveled in India. Al-Biruni had been trained in the methodology and philosophy of the Greek mathematicians, and he reported on his scientific exchange with Indian colleagues as follows. So this is a Muslim intellectually formed with the Greek Pythagorean mathematicians, with the, we would say, scientific method, well, prior to Francis Bacon and so on, but with the inductive, deductive method. And this man gives his testimony before people in your country, India, and I would say under the stars of your would say under the stars of the sky of Mumbai, you could say. I began to show, says Al-Biruni, to Indian scholars, the elements on which this science rests, to point out to them some rules of logical deduction and the scientific methods of all mathematics. And then they flocked together round me from all parts. It's a very nice scene. Wondering and most eager to learn from me. I can only compare their mathematical and astronomical literature, as far as I know it, to a mixture of pearl shells and sure dates, or of pearls and dung, or of costly crystals and common pebbles. It's a very nice description. Both kinds of things, he says, to finish, are equal in their eyes. Both kinds of things, I would say, mythos and logos, are equal in their eyes, since they cannot since they cannot rise themselves to the methods of a strictly scientific deduction. What a nice witness from a Muslim astrologer formed in the mathematical Greek rationalism when he visits India in the 11th century, and he grasps that for you Indians, for your ancestors, mythos and logos are paired and take part of the same knowledge, which have to say that it is not the case of Western culture, and this is the point. And being not the case of Western culture, the art is gonna be different. And why it is not gonna be the case of Western culture? Or, to put it in different terms, what is the central part of the so-called Greek miracle? Because nowadays I have been to Athens, the contemporary Greece, and I don't see any Plato, I don't see any Aristotle, as in Italy, I don't see any Aquinas. I mean, we are in a kind of decadency, but it seems that the central part of the former Greek miracle was the defeat of myth by reason, or mythos by logos. And this is something quite that gives us quite unquietness to all of us, because, and this is, I would say that to provoke a little bit of discussion, if Europe, we can say, has no future from an intellectual point of view, it is maybe because we have split mythos and logos. If India has future from an intellectual point of view, it is maybe because in your cultural systems, mythos and logos are still all together. Mythos, we have to understand what is mythos. Mythos is kind of just stories. Stories. The mythos of Atlantis, who is that man who is carrying on his shoulders the entire globe of the earth. This is Atlantis. And you say, well, but Atlantis does not exist. Atlantis is false. Yes, but you have to wonder, what is Atlantis myth telling to us? Well, Atlantis myth is telling to us the importance of the encyclopedic knowledge the importance of responsibility. Someone has to carry everything with himself, herself. Everyone has to solve the whole problems of things, and this is true. So that we see how a kind of false myth can deliver an authentic logics to us. And what is logos? Myths are kind of stories. And what is logos? Well, logos is the kind of rational explanation of things. So what is going to happen in the cycle of human history is the central theme of this speech, which is that there is a human nature, and there's a human time on earth. That logos can explain this rationally, philosophically. And what we have to see is how from this very foundation of the Neoplatonic system, we can move into the specification of these images through art, through aesthetics, and through this Western ocular centrism. Well, maybe Professor Mariano, this is time to give some, because as far as I see, I have done 25 minutes or even more. And if you like, the floor is yours.
Okay. So thank you, Professor Alfons. Well, perhaps there is some question, some query. This has been just a very introductory chapter in which the emphasis was in this comparison of mythos, myth, and logos, both in East and West. Yes, in Western philosophy, especially among the Greeks, it is defined, no, that philosophy is the path from myth to logos. So, in case there is some question, you can raise your hand or you can write it on the chat. Otherwise, we can go to the second block of today's presentation.
Feel absolutely free to intervene, to correct me or to add new concepts, or because I have stepped on your cultural territory, so maybe you don't say anything because you are very annoyed, no? So feel free, please.
I think it will take some time because more contents are explained and developed that will facilitate the discussion.
Okay, so may I keep going then?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. What is the very school, no, Western school that has developed this split between mythos and logos, no? Because yes, there was an archaic Greece. It was that time when the representation of humans were idealized, and we can say, well, how unsophisticated were these people? Yes, but these people were contemporary to Homer, the author of the Odyssey and the Iliad. We can say, yes, but Homer was a poet of myths. Well, yes, he was a poet of myths, but the excavation of Troya is something real. So who were these people? Who were these people? Well, first of all, we have to talk about the two great Greek historians, no? Herodotus and Thucydides. No? Herodotus and Thucydides were historians. They were not just thinkers, or they were not just philosophers. And yes, they did not point at this difference between mythos and logos in a very neat way, but in a kind of in-between character. No? So they said history has the in-between character between mythos and logos. The centrality of logos is, of course, in Sophism, the school which is basically the school of dialogue, the school of dialogue, where the master talks to the student, and they solve problems in a dialectical way. This dialectical way, which is called maieutics, is this sort of main formulation of what is logos. Sophism studies the power of logos in and of itself. It is logos that persuades and deceives. It is not the speaker. This is very important. It is logos, the word, which convinces us, but not the speaker. This dialogue is to push logos farther. The speaker learns how to use logos. And this view of logos arises naturally from the traditional neutrality of the word as denoting speech pure and simple. So it is the importance of the word. This is logos. Not just of the agent who uses the word. And there is a second point in logos. It is that the social and political context of the sophistic rhetorics, the sophistic rhetorics is the use of this word in a beautiful way. Where it is developed in a social and political context, in the increasing importance of public debate in democratic Greek cities. So it is these kind of two ideas concerning the importance of the logos amongst Sophism as a school of thought, which is that what is important is the logos in itself or in herself, and concerning the use of the logos, it is important the public use of logos to make politics. Concerning this, when Plutarch starts writing his parallel lives, and he put in parallel these two in the mythological language, these two heroes of the old times, which are Theseus and Romulus. He explains, Plutarch, the foundation of the city of Rome, how it was founded, the city of Rome, by Romulus. Romulus, who gave his name to the city of Rome. And Plutarch says, well, people arrived from different tribes, from all over the places, with bags of the sand, the earth of their parents, what is called the patria, the terra patris, the earth of their parents. And then Romulus said, we have to choose a plot. And Romulus and his people chose a plot. And to choose a plot, it is a very logical decision. It is abstract, because a plot is geometry, but it is a very logical decision. Then they carved a semi-sphere on the ground, to which they call mundus, which means world. And this is also a very logical way of behaving, to say this is the mundus, this is our world. And within this mundus, they put the earth of the parents of all tribes. And then on this, they built up an altar, they made a sacrifice, they burned something of value, and this sacrifice of fire connected the earth and the heaven, the north and the south, the east and the west. And they mark around with horses and a copper grill, they mark around the perimeter, which was going to be the walls of the city. And this was called polis, politics. But what is in the very center of the Greek cities, of the Roman cities, of the ancient European cities? What is in the very center? It is the word, it is the logos. And what is there between this very center, this very logos, and the wall? It is rationality. And what is outside the walls, in exile? It is irrationality. It is stories that people talk. It is in some way mythos. So this is to keep going, no? with these progressive rationalization of ideas, of images, started by Herodotus and Thucydides, continued and crystallized by Plato and the sophists in his dialogues, in his maeutics, and giving in this way this bipolarity between participation and emancipation. Or we can say between liturgy, participation, and persona, emancipation. Persona as defined by Boëtius as this rational, as this individual substance with rationality. That's why we have to be courageous, because it is true that a Western student of Advaita, I would say, like me, cannot approach his philosophical subject in the same way as a philosophy which belongs to his own tradition, of course. Nobody is entirely free to think as he wishes. For first reactions are partly determined by a philosophical background. So I have to understand in some way how difficult it is for me to explain all these from my own tradition, from which I am not detached completely, and addressing towards yourselves. The relation to my own background is determining the direction that I should take in order to reach a system of thought like Advaita. So, as I want to say again, the simplest kind of comparative philosophy comes into being. So I'm not sure what do my words mean for you, because I am trying to bridge our two traditions, and I am trying to move without falling. That's why comparative philosophy, therefore, cannot be avoided when a system like Advaita is studied outside its own tradition. So I am a kind of foreigner, and that's why in this comparative philosophy I have to take in account in some way what has been already taken in account, which is comparative linguistics and the comparative study of religions. These are kind of the two sources to advance all together. And that's why I said before that both disciplines, linguistic studies, and we talk about Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, but also a comparative study of religions. We talk about Hinduism, we talk about the Greek religions, the Greek mythologies, the Mithraic Roman religions, and we will talk about Christianity as well, where, as I said, mainly the study of Sanskrit for you as an European, Indo-European language led to comparative linguistics and this advancement to get all together in the knowledge, and enable us to pass judgments which may be universally accepted by scholars as kind of objective true. That's why if we want to understand, if we really want to understand Neoplatonism, we have to see to what extent it is similar and and can have many things in common with your own traditions. We share Greeks and Indians forms of monistic idealism. This is a key point. And maybe with this, I'm moving a bit to the third stage of this talk, without solution of continuity. Because based on the text of Plotinus, Plotinus, from who we know very much, born in Alexandria in 204 of the modern era, and dead in Alexandria in 270. We are moving in this late antiquity, 3rd century, a character belonging to the school of the Stoics, or the Stoa, a mystic, we could say a man of God, who used to have a disease in his skin. And nobody knows about this disease, but Plotinus seems that he used to have a kind of psoriasis, no? This disease on the surface of the skin, and that is similar to leper but different, not so aggressive. And being Plotinus very affective with his friends and having this disease in his skin, Porphyrius, his biographer, says that his friends, when they saw Plotinus going by the street, they changed from one side to the other side of the street, not to feel obliged to kiss him because of his ugly aspect of the skin. So Plotinus was a man completely uninterested in the material world. Comparative studies of the monistic schools of Greece and India are not new. The most difficult point here is the historical, because indeed Plotinus, this is a big paradox, Plotinus was not a pure rationalistic Hellenistic thinker. It seems that Plotinus was influenced by the Indians, as well as that Indians could be influenced by Plotinus. This is the hypothesis of Émile Breillet that talked about Plotinus and India. Which is clear is that when we talk about Plotinus, it is very easy to talk about Neoplatonism and Param Advaita. And this is a comparison that has been made, has been studied, and it is difficult, but it is familiar for specialists. Advaita and Neoplatonism was studied by the Dutch Indologist Stahl, which compare efficiently Neoplatonism with Advaita Vedanta of Adi Shankaracharya. And this is being considered a branch of Indian non-dualism, originated in Kashmir, in the very northwest corner of India. You know that its essential stress on the dynamic aspect of the absolute makes it a far more suitable, but yet unexplored comparandum to Neoplatonic monism, which is also a dynamic system rather than a static hierarchy. To this that I'm mentioning, so to recapitulate, I said I have explained first to what extent we are in this session of today in this evolutive movement between the ancient mythos stories and the Greek logos, which is rationalism. In what way this has happened in the Western world, and in what way in the Indian cultural history, this split, this separation is a very different stuff all the way, because in the Indian system of thought, philosophy and religion are difficult to split. The predominant sense of Western thinking is going to be visuality, it's going to be the ocular centrism. That's why in the further sessions, we are going to talk about the medieval system, and in the third, the Renaissance system, which is mathematical, and is going to be based on the ocular centrism, whereas your traditions are less logocentric and more liturgical, more based in the importance of the word, the importance of linguistic, and the importance of recitation in order to attain the beauty. That's why Plotinus is, you can say, well, Plotinus, following this Oriental hypothesis of Emile Breyer, Plotinus was influenced in some way by Indians, and Indians were influenced in some way by Plotinus. You say, well, then Plotinus is not so rationalistic. Plotinus, you can say, is as we are. And Plotinus is more Indian than Western. What is the sources for Plotinus? Well, the sources for Plotinus is Corpus Platonicum. That means the works of Plato, of sophism, as far as the source of Shankara is the Upanishads. And this is the parallel. This is the parallel. And so yes, the French antique philosophy, Emile Breyer identified the source of the foreign elements in Plotinus. as the teaching from the Indian Upanishads. So, did Plotinus read Upanishads? Of course, we don't know. But what we know for sure is that, and this is very important in this difference between Advaita and Neoplatonism, is that Plotinus works as an independent philosopher from Plato, whereas Shankara and other masters of Hinduism, they work completely attached to their sources. And this is very important. You have the Sriti and you have the gurus. Whereas for Plotinus, the corpus Neoplatonicum was not a Sriti, was not a revelation, to put in this way, and Plotinus was not only a commentator of the Corpus Platonicum. He developed individually his own philosophical system. And this is going to be important. It is true that Advaita and Neoplatonism, they share their notions of the absolute. I'm going to try to share my screen. It is, yes, this one, to show you the Platonic system, sorry, the Plotinus or Plotinian system. So we have seen this, we are talking about this, we're in this session, and this is one of the images we know of Plotinus Philosophus, see it here. But I was telling you that, yes, Advaita and Neoplatonism, they have different notions of the absolute. Whereas the absolute of Neoplatonism is a potential infinity, the absolute of Advaita is an actual infinity. So this is the system. This is the Platonic forms. I don't know if you see the pointer moving. Do you see my pointing moving in the screen? My pointer? No. Okay, you don't see it, so let me use
Yes,
it.
can be seen.
We can see, we can see.
Ah, you can see. Okay, thank you. So, okay. This is the corpus Platonicum, okay? Platonic forms, which means a system derived from Plato's dialogue. Plato is in the 5th century before the Common Era. So this is going to be 8 centuries before Plotinus, 7 or 8 centuries before Plotinus, where these Platonic forms are supposed to be completely detached from the earthly beings, and these Platonic forms are the only real things, whereas the physical, the matter, are only copies of the real ideas. So for Plato, all what we see in this earthly life are shadows of these Platonic forms. At the peak of these Platonic forms, there is the idea of good for Plato. So this is the basis for Plotinus, the corpus Platonicus that is used by Plotinus as Shankara used the Upanishad for his own comments. At the very low part of these Platonic forms, there is an intersection, which is the noetic mind, between the upper soul, the upper part of the human soul, and these Platonic forms. So that we have an upper superior soul and a lower inferior soul. Thanks to this part of superior soul that is overlapped with the Platonic form in a noetic mind, thanks to that, we can think ontologically. We can think ontologically and attached to this very notion of the one, which is called the nous, which is the most real thing in this system. That's why I am commenting this difference between Advaita and Neoplatonism in their very notions of the absolute. Because here, where the nous is a potential absolute, in Advaitism, this absolute is factual, So, following your system, we are part of this factual absolute, whether our minds, our soul, and even though the matter. That's why even though both are a dynamic and pulsing one, from the pole of potential infinity to the pole of actually and back again. The dynamic, the living, pulsing absolute is the very core of the teaching of both traditions. So Platonic forms, these nous, there is a, from here, it is like a stone thrown out on a lake that is making different new circles, generating new realities, so that the noetic principle can generate the upper soul, and after the upper soul, the lower soul. This is the midpoint of all the system, the midpoint, not the central point. The central point is here in the one. It comes ontological thinking. It comes then empirical thinking, discursive reason, impressions, and then this individual soul, which is interesting to animate the body with its sensation, with its passions, with its organic growth, with its reproduction. No? So the more we go up, the more real become things. The more we go down, the more matter like are things, the less real they will go. But there is always a return from the non-being to the being, passing through always through a cycle of matter, psyche, nous, and then again, psyche, matter, non-being, so that this absolute is dynamic, like the Advaitic seat that we are quoting constantly, comparing the Advaitic seat with the Neoplatonic nous. I repeat that the very possibility of establishing such an identity and of receiving meaningful outputs is opened by the non-obvious common base of both traditions, which lies in metaphors common to both systems and which can be founded in their older referential strata, is to say, Upanishads on the side of Advaita and the Corpus Platonicum on the side of Neoplatonism. I have commented then Neoplatonism as a dynamic system, as well as, although more secondarily, Paramadvaita as a dynamic monism. So that all here, all is in all in this system. The dynamism of this Neoplatonic one is carried through on each level of its hierarchy. On every level, it is realized by the phase of outflowing potency, which subsequently turns towards its source, thus creating itself in its fully formed shape. The ultimate source of this potency is the Neoplatonic absolute, the one, but its self-creative power is delegated to all subsequently created levels of intellect and soul. Every ontological level is thus, in its own way, present on a lower plane, which is again in its own turn present on a higher one. Generally summed up by a student of Plotinus, Proclus, everything exists as a cause on its higher level, as a substance on its own level, and as a participated unity on the subsequent lower level, so that the mutual presence of all in all is not limited to the vertical axis of the Neoplatonic system, but it is present in each self-established level. Then the paradigmatic level on which Plotinus develops his doctrine of the holistic interconnection and even interpenetration of everything with everything else is precisely the intellect. Well, this is basically what we have to see in the proper days. It was very needed following our program. I share with you again the screen. It was said at the very beginning that this is the main idea from myth to logos, no? Which maybe you didn't expect is to, in this topic of introduction to Neoplatonism, you maybe didn't expect that I stepped on your own tradition. And I decided to do this because I feel familiar with your institution, I feel familiar with your country and familiar with your intellectual tradition. I understood, preparing this, that in your intellectual and religious culture, myth and logos might be all together, that you have a more liturgical, in the sense that performative culture than logocentric. I have used the character and ideas of Plotinus to say, well, we have to take in account that in following the Oriental hypothesis, Plotinus could have been a reader of the Upanishads, but taking in account that he is not a commentator either of the Upanishads, of course, or of the Corpus Platonicum. He is an exception in the context of Hellenistic rationalistic thought, but that he is a thinker with independent ideas. He is not only a commentator. This Greek logos is going to turn with another very important Neo-Platonic thinker from the north of Africa, Augustine of Hipona. This Greek logos from Augustine of Hipona, who read Plotinus, is gonna turn a new story that is gonna allow us to step on theology and the visual arts of the next week, as well as in this relationship between arts and Neoplatonism. We will manage to comment on Western religious art, as well as Plotinus and the first Christian art, Pseudo-Dionysius, as I said, Saint Augustine and religious art, as well as the possibility of step on a commentary on the European cathedrals that whenever we travel, especially to the north of Europe, we can admire. Thank you very much. The floor again is yours if you want to intervene, and I will try to answer your questions and hear with interest all your comments.
Thank you, Professor Alfons. There is one question here in the chat from Nitin Kulkarnis. The question is, if you can throw some light on the reasons of the dualistic nature of ocular centrism in the Western tradition.
Yes. Nitin, can you introduce yourself, if possible? Nitin, are you over there already? Okay.
He needs to be unmuted.
Yes, it was very enlightening for me because I am art student. Last 30 years I have been an art student. Still I am a student. I'm a design teacher actually, art and design faculty, and doing my research on perception of India and West in terms of visual arts. So it's a very enlightening to see these thoughts. And how does this, you talked about the influence of non-dualistic and dualistic traditions. So it was really interesting to see these interfaces on
Yes.
these different cultures. But the question arises that why the visual is more important to Western traditions. The aspect of seeing more than listening, is it so? Like, this is the question arising. And in India, do we see more of the sound, or the more of the listening and word and spoken word rather than written word? The sound of a word seems to be more important for Indian traditions. So how does that relate to the non-dualistic approach in? So you may not talk about that, but I'm very interested to know the Western traditional part.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me try to use the blackboard. Do we have the blackboard? Because I don't see the blackboard.
I'm not sure that there is such a facility. Rudraksha, is there a way in which he can write on something?
Sir, if you click on the share screen, there is option of sharing the whiteboard.
Whiteboard, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
yes, thank you. Thank you. So, well, I think he's, just to summarize his question, he says about the importance of sound traditions, say India. Of course, who is asking this? He says that he's a student of arts, and then he's asking on why in more ocular centric, let's say Western traditions, why these are dualistic and yes, basically dualist. No? I think that this is the question. Let me look for. This is the question. This one.
Yes.
Is that right? This is your question. Hmm?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so here,
How this I does I relate to the information which we receive from I, the knowledge which we receive by, is it dualistic in nature? That in the
yes.
way I wanted to arrive at that. Yeah.
Now, we have to say one step here and a second step here, okay? Now, here, we can put all together both Advaita and Plotinus in non-dualistic, okay? And here, here we have to say okay. Now, what is going to happen here, we understand that today we have been talking about this, right? So I talk about this because I realize, especially for you who study Sanskrit and Hindu culture, I have learned and I realized how important is sound in your aesthetic tradition and cultural history. I have put a mark and explain our ocular centric culture as far as dualistic, right? Now, this is non-dualistic. I think everybody understood that Advaita is non-dualistic, and I also think everybody understood that as a common philosophical system, Neoplatonism and Advaita both have the non-dualistic approach in their philosophical and religious system. Now, what is going to happen later? What is going to happen later? And later is going to happen that we are going to have a new element in our Western tradition, which is the Christian revelation. So, like you have the Upanishads in Western culture, we are going to have the Christian revelation, and very especially the so-called New Testament, right? But, and this is very important to stress, this New Testament, which is Christian treaty, is going to be added to the Greek Logos, which is clearly dualistic. This Greek Logos is dualistic precisely because of the nature of dialogue, the nature of maieutics, and the nature of word in this sense, no? Not mythos, but logos. But there is a third element, which is the Hebrew treaty, which are going to pair with the Christian treaty, and the Hebrew treaty are going to pair in a new compact treaty, which is the Bible, right? Where we will see here that God is a person and that Logos is person, right? So let's gonna review these. No, a person is visible. A person is visible. A person is ocular. So this ocular-centric Western dualism is going to be explained through the very concept which is going to be received through Christian and Hebrew treaty in the Bible as God as a person. This is going to give not only the ocular-centric condition of God, but also the dualistic nature of Western art, right? And this is, in some way, this is the foundation, in some way, the foundation of Western Christian art. If we establish here a bit of blackboard inside the blackboard, you can say here Greek Logos, and here establish. Okay. Now, from the perspective of the history of culture, which means the history of philosophy, the history of religion, and the history of arts, we have that whenever these Greek logos, and we will see this in images of temples, in paintings, literature, and so on, whenever these Greek logos that has in some way evacuated his mythological notion, and it is more now reason than story, and it comes the Christian treaty saying that this Greek logos now is God, then everything turns ocular-centric and everything turns dualistic. This is the answer to your question. Before removing this blackboard, because if I remove this blackboard, we will lose all this information. You can add another comment.
Thank you so much for such an elaborate answer. And obviously, I'm going to read in this week and come back next week if there are any further questions.
Nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Anyone,
you. Thank you.
anyone else want to comment on this blackboard? Okay, then we go back to zoom de pantalla. Okay, but we have another question here. Any more comments on this last question? Can we move into the next question? Okay. Mariano, I don't hear you.
I was saying that there are several other questions. Now we are beyond time. I don't know how much time is left to finish. Perhaps
Okay.
you can tell us.
Let me, if you like, I can read through the resting questions, and in 3-4 minutes, I'm gonna comment on the resting questions altogether, right? Do you agree with that?
Yes, yes. Perhaps a quick answer.
Yes.
And more elaborated to be next class.
Okay. So there is a question here: is the Neoplatonism the combination of Shraman tradition, Buddhist Jainism, which is rational in nature, and Hindu philosophy, which believe in Brahmana? This is one question. How will you exactly distinguish between potential and factual absolute? Another question. Isn't sound important in every linguistic study? Why signify Indian languages only? Okay. So, I will write on your questions, because you are stepping on topics that are of kind of long development, but maybe an answer to your to these several questions. Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say that the proper answer, I mean, being general, but maybe a proper answer to your questions is that, what does it mean, the word for Hinduism, and what does it mean, the word for Western culture? I think that the word for Hinduism means directly religion, with no distinction between religion, philosophy, culture, art. The word is everything. Whereas in Western thought, because in our treaty, in our revelation, it is said that the word is person, the word is human, the word is flesh. This means that our culture turned from being literary or sound culture into more visual or incarnated culture. This is the, if you think on my words that will be further developed in the next session, you will see that with this meditation on the role of the word in our corresponding different cultures, which are complementary, but in this meditation on the role of the word in culture, we will discover the answer to these questions, as well as to the previous question, which is that, as we will see next week, this word, this logos, now more detached from the mythos, is gonna be the image of man and the image of the world. Thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much, Professor Alfons. And I think we are ready for next class, next Monday, at the same time, at 5 p.m. here in India. And it will be on theology and the visual arts. So now I pass the microphone to Mrs. Prajpatak, principal of KG Somaiya Vidyavihar University.
I'm just here